The room went quiet before anyone understood why, not the polite quiet of a formal dinner, not the rehearsed silence before a toast. This was the kind of quiet that falls when something has gone wrong, when the air shifts before the sound catches up. But nobody had noticed Aubrey Mack yet. He was still just a man in gray coveralls pushing a mop cart through the service entrance of the Claridge ballroom, and the 400 guests of the Harrington Foundation Gala were too busy being important to notice a man who cleaned up after them. That part would come later. The Claridge was the kind of hotel that didn't advertise. You either knew about it or you didn't, and if you had to ask, the answer was already no. Tucked into the corner of Bay and Wellington in Toronto's financial district, it had hosted prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, and the kind of private dinners that never made the papers. The carpets were burgundy and thick enough to swallow sound. The chandeliers were original, shipped from Vienna in 1923. The grand piano in the East Ballroom, a 9-foot Bösendorfer Imperial, had not been touched by an amateur since the hotel opened. Aubrey Mack had been cleaning that ballroom for 11 months. He worked the overnight maintenance shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. His supervisor, a compact and efficient woman named Shirley Beckwith, had assigned him to the East Wing, specifically because he was quiet. Because he didn't take breaks he hadn't earned, and because he had a way of moving through a space without disturbing it. Shirley had worked at the Claridge for 19 years, and she knew the difference between a man going through motions and a man who understood that a room, even an empty one, deserved a kind of respect. She had never asked Aubrey what he did before the Claridge. She had noticed once that his hands were large and slightly scarred, the knuckles flattened in a way that suggested a history of labor. But his hands were always clean, always deliberate, and Shirley Beckwith was not the kind of person who needed to know a man's whole story to know his character. What she did not know, what almost no one at the Claridge knew, was that Aubrey Mack had spent 22 years as a touring pianist with the Royal Conservatory's concert circuit, that he had performed at Carnegie Hall 3 separate times, that his recording of Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit had been described by a Globe and Mail critic as technically unassailable and emotionally devastating, and that in 2019 he had been invited to play a private recital for the Governor-General of Canada at Rideau Hall. A performance that had lasted 40 minutes and ended with a standing ovation from 40 of the country's most distinguished citizens. None of that was on his cleaning cart. The night of the Harrington Gala, Aubrey arrived at 15 minutes early the way he always was. The event staff were still clearing the last of the dinner service. He waited by the service corridor, back against the wall, watching the stragglers drift toward the exit. There was a man near the piano. Not unusual. People were always drawn to the Bösendorfer, always circling it, touching the lid, pressing a key or two with the guilty thrill of children near something valuable. What was unusual was that this particular man, tall, silver-haired, wearing a dinner jacket that probably cost more than Aubrey's monthly rent, had planted himself at the piano's edge with the proprietorial ease of someone who believed the instrument was, in some important sense, his. His name was Renfield Greer. Renfield Greer was the kind of man whose wealth had calcified into personality. He had made his money in private equity in the 90s, had lost most of it in 2001, had made it back twice over by 2008, and had since spent the intervening years converting that money into social architecture, board seats, charitable foundations, naming rights on buildings, a face that appeared reliably at galas and tributes and ribbon cuttings. He donated to the arts the way some men donated to their own statues, publicly, carefully, with one eye always on the plaque. Tonight, he was the Harrington Foundation's guest of honor. He stood at the Bösendorfer and pressed middle C with one finger. Then he pressed it again. The sound was pure and round, and it moved through the nearly empty ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Renfield Greer smiled the smile of a man who expected the world to admire him for possessing taste. Aubrey Mack watched this from the service corridor and said nothing. He wheeled his cart to the far end of the room, began with the baseboards the way Shirley had trained him, worked slow and methodical, kept his back to the piano. He was almost done with the eastern quadrant when he heard the bench scrape against the marble floor. He turned. Renfield Greer had sat down at the Bösendorfer. What followed was the sound a piano makes when someone plays it who should not be playing it. 4 bars of something that might have been Chopin, blundering and flat, the timing lurching like a man who had been told about rhythm but never actually felt it. Greer played with the confidence of someone who had once had lessons and had forgotten most of them, but retained enough to believe he had retained all of them. It was the musical equivalent of a man who had read one book about surgery. Aubrey moved to the far end of the room. He wasn't going to say anything. That wasn't his place, not here, not in this job, and he understood very clearly what his place was. But he stood at the edge of the service corridor and he listened to Renfield Greer massacre the opening of Nocturne in E-flat major. And something in his chest contracted the way it does when a person watches something beautiful being treated carelessly. Greer stopped playing, reached for his phone, took a photo of himself at the piano. Aubrey went back to work. That might have been the end of it, except that Renfield Greer had not finished for the evening. He returned 20 minutes later with 3 men from the Foundation's board, younger men, the kind who wore their wealth in subtler ways, expensive watches and flat effect, and a woman named Constance White, the Foundation's executive director, who had the energy of someone who had spent the entire evening managing Renfield Greer and was not finished yet. Greer sat down at the Bösendorfer again. Aubrey was near the piano now, working the floor around the instrument's base, his mop in slow, careful arcs that avoided the pedal mechanisms and the carved legs. He was doing his job the way he always did, quietly, precisely, aware of the space he occupied. Greer saw him and stopped. "You're in my way," Greer said. Aubrey stepped back. "Sorry, I'll go around." "No, I mean," Greer gestured at the cart, at the mop, at Aubrey's existence in that particular corner of the room. "I mean all of it. Move it." Aubrey nodded and began to push the cart away. "Hang on," said one of the board members, a wide man with a jaw like a shelf, whose name Aubrey would later learn was Denton Hale. Hale was looking at Aubrey with the specific attention of a man who has just registered that another person is present and is deciding on the basis of very little information what that person's worth. "What are you doing in here?" "Event's over. I'm on the overnight maintenance team," Aubrey said. "I clean the East Ballroom after events." "Well, we're still using the room," Denton Hale said. "I can come back," Renfield, Constance White, began. "No, stay," Greer said, not looking at Aubrey, already repositioning his hands on the keys. "We're not going to be long. He can wait by the wall." And so Aubrey Mack, who had performed at Carnegie Hall, who had shaken the hand of the Governor-General of Canada in a receiving line at Rideau Hall, stood with his mop cart near the east wall of the Claridge Ballroom and waited while Renfield Greer played 4 bars of Chopin badly. This happened twice more before Greer stood up and turned to his companions with a satisfied expression and said, "That's the thing about the piano. It rewards commitment." Constance White said, Denton Hale said, "Absolutely." Renfield Greer put his hand on the piano's lid, and then he looked at Aubrey Mack for what felt like the first time, really looked at him, the coveralls and the cart and the mop, and something happened in his face. Some recalibration. He said, "You know what the problem with places like this is?" Aubrey said nothing. "They let anyone in," Greer said. "During the day, whatever. But at night, the Claridge used to have standards about who was in a room like this." He wasn't looking at Aubrey anymore. He was looking at the Bösendorfer. "A room with an instrument like that shouldn't have to share air with a cleaning cart. There's something wrong with that picture." The 3 board members were quiet. Constance White looked at a spot on the wall. Aubrey Mack looked at Renfield Greer for exactly 3 seconds. Then he nodded once and pushed his cart to the service corridor. He stopped in the doorway. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the cart handle, and the thing that went through him then was not anger. Anger was too clean for it. It was something older and more exhausting. The specific fatigue of a man who has spent his life being reduced to whatever other people needed him to be in any given moment. He left the cart in the corridor. He walked back into the ballroom. Greer saw him coming and his expression shifted. Confusion first, then something like irritation. "I thought I told you." Aubrey Mack walked past him. He sat down at the Bösendorfer. What happened next would be described differently by each of the 5 people who witnessed it, because the thing about a genuinely extraordinary moment is that it reorganizes itself in memory, according to what each person needed it to mean. Constance White would later say she knew within the first 4 bars. The quality of sound changed, she would tell a reporter from the Toronto Star. The whole room changed, the airs changed. Denton Hale would tell the story for years at dinners, and in his version, he had always sensed something about the man, had always known, had watched carefully from the beginning. Nobody would challenge this. Renfield Greer's account would evolve over time in ways that were interesting to observe. But what actually happened, in the moment before any of them could think of what to say, was this. Aubrey Mack placed his hands on the keys. Not the tentative, performative hand placement of a man showing off, but the settled, unself-conscious positioning of a man coming home, and he began to play. He began with the same Chopin nocturne Greer had been attempting, not as a statement, not as a rebuke. He began there simply because it was where the room was, because that was the phrase still hanging in the air, and Aubrey Mack had spent enough years listening to music to know that a room has a key and you begin where you are. The nocturne opened, and it was nothing like what Greer had played. It was not technically superior in the way that a better athlete might run a faster time. That comparison would have missed the point entirely. It was different in kind. Where Greer had imposed himself on the music, Aubrey Mack let the music exist. He followed it somewhere. The sound in that ballroom became something you lived inside rather than listened to. Renfield Greer opened his mouth and closed it. Denton Hale took a step back, then another, and then quietly sat down on the edge of a chair near the wall. Constance White's hand went to her mouth. Aubrey moved through the nocturne, and then, without breaking the silence that followed, he moved into something else, an original composition. Though none of them would know that, a piece he had written in 2017 during the 3 months he spent at an artist residency in Cape Breton. It was a piece that began in a minor key and never quite found its resolution, that circled something it was looking for, that kept almost arriving somewhere and then turning, and the effect was of a man walking through a place he knew well in a season he hadn't expected. It was 11 minutes long and it felt like no time at all. When he finished, the room was very still. Renfield Greer said, "What was that?" Aubrey took his hands from the keys. He did not look at Greer. He looked at the piano, the way you look at something when you're saying goodbye to it, and then he stood up. "That was mine," he said. Constance White caught him in the corridor. She was a quick, precise woman in her late 40s, and she moved the way people move when they've spent their careers in philanthropy, with the contained urgency of someone who has learned to act before the moment closes. She said, "I need you to wait, please." Aubrey stopped. "Who are you?" she said. He told her his name. She looked at him for a moment. Then she took out her phone and typed his name into a search engine, and whatever came back made her look up at him with an expression that was equal parts admiration and something very much like guilt. The Google results for Aubrey Mack included a performance review from the New York Times, a recording on the Royal Conservatory's YouTube channel with 400,000 views, a Wikipedia entry, and a photograph of him at Rideau Hall in 2019, shaking the hand of the Governor General. In the photograph, he was wearing a tuxedo. He looked exactly like himself. "Mr. Mack," Constance White said. "It's fine," Aubrey said. "It is not fine," she said. "What Renfield said to you. It's not the first time," he said. "That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She stood there for a moment, her phone in her hand, the ballroom behind them. Then she said, "The Harrington Foundation's Spring Concert Series. We've been looking for a featured performer for the April event. The venue is Roy Thomson Hall. We've been having trouble finding the right fit." She paused. "I'm looking at the right fit." Aubrey looked at her. "The fee is significant," she said. "I can send you numbers tomorrow. I'll need an answer within the week because the program goes to print." Aubrey said, "You should know, I'm not currently represented. I stepped back from performing a few years ago. Personal reasons. I'm not asking about your representation," Constance White said. "I'm asking if you want to play." Aubrey was quiet for a moment. The service corridor was a specific kind of quiet. The hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of a freight elevator somewhere below. He had spent 11 months in this building, in this hallway, and it looked entirely different to him now than it had an hour ago. "Yes," he said. "I want to play." Renfield Greer did not find out who Aubrey Mack was that night. He found out the following Thursday, when the Harrington Foundation issued a press release announcing the Spring Concert Series lineup and the featured performer, whose photograph appeared in the release alongside a brief biography. The release was picked up by the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and the CBC. The human interest angle was impossible to miss. A celebrated Canadian pianist, a Rideau Hall performance, a 2-year absence from the concert stage, a return at Roy Thomson Hall, and, because Constance White had decided, with the careful judgment of someone who had spent 19 years in the arts, that the full story was both relevant and important. A brief mention of the circumstances under which he had been rediscovered. The mention was diplomatic. It referred to an unscheduled performance at a private foundation gala and noted that the performer had been employed at the venue in a maintenance capacity at the time. It didn't need to say more. The people who read it understood what it meant. The comments on the CBC article ran to 340 replies before the moderation team closed the thread. The most upvoted comment read, "This is what happens when you measure a man by the uniform instead of the hands inside it." It had been liked 912 times. Renfield Greer did not comment publicly. His assistant sent a brief note to Constance White's office stating that he looked forward to attending the April concert and hoped the event would be a success. The note was written on foundation letterhead. The note was not answered. The April concert at Roy Thomson Hall was sold out within 72 hours of tickets going on sale. This was not entirely unusual for a Harrington Foundation event. They had strong institutional support and a committed donor base. But it was unusual for it to sell out that fast, and the front-of-house team noted privately that the demographic was different than expected. Younger, more diverse. The kind of audience that had read something online and wanted to be in the room. Aubrey Mack arrived for sound check at 3 in the afternoon. He stood on the stage of Roy Thomson Hall, a stage he had stood on before 14 years ago for a program that had included Debussy, Satie, and 2 of his own compositions, and he placed his hands on the Steinway concert grand and played a single chord. The hall absorbed it, gave it back. 3,000 seats, empty and waiting. He played for 40 minutes without stopping, running through nothing in particular, following the thread wherever it went. Because that was how he had always warmed up, and it had never stopped being the right way. The sound engineer, a young man from Scarborough named Andre, sat at the mixing board and did not touch anything. He watched, and he said nothing, and when Aubrey finally stopped and looked out at the empty seats, Andre started clapping. Alone in the empty hall, both hands, no hesitation. The sound of it moved through the space and multiplied strangely. Aubrey laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised him. "Sorry," Andre said. "Don't be," Aubrey said. That evening, the program was as follows. The first half built from Chopin and Ravel and a Canadian composer named Oliver Whitfield, whose Piano Sonata No. 3 Aubrey had championed years earlier and had never entirely left alone. The second half was entirely original work. When he walked out onto the stage, the applause was immediate and warm. He sat down, arranged himself, waited for the room to settle. He did not look at the audience. He looked at the piano. He played. What followed was an hour and 40 minutes of music, with a 15-minute intermission, during which the lobby was so loud with conversation that the ushers had difficulty getting people back into their seats. In the second half, when Aubrey played the Cape Breton composition, the piece he had played in the Claridge Ballroom 11 months ago, the piece he had played for no one, and then suddenly for everyone. The hall was so quiet between phrases that you could hear someone breathing 3 rows back. When he finished, he sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. Then he stood and turned to face the audience. The applause began. It did not stop for a long time. It rolled and swelled and came back in waves, and somewhere in the 4th row a woman stood up, and then a man beside her. And then it spread the way standing ovations spread when they're real, which is nothing like the polite ones, nothing like the obligatory ones. It was fast and involuntary, like catching a reflex. Aubrey stood at the front of the stage. He did not cry. He did not perform humility or perform gratitude. He looked out at the 3,000 people standing in Roy Thomson Hall, and he let himself feel the full weight of the moment without flinching from it, because he had spent 2 years being very quiet, and a long time before that performing for rooms that had forgotten him before he reached the exit. And this was different, and he was old enough to know when something was different. He bowed once, deep and slow. The applause continued. There is a bench in the east corridor of Roy Thomson Hall, near the stage door, where performers sit between the end of a concert and the beginning of everything that follows. The reception, the donors, the handshakes, the photographs. Aubrey sat there after the curtain calls, still in his concert clothes, a glass of water in his hand. Constance White found him there. She sat down beside him without asking, which was the kind of ease that forms between people who have, in a short time, been through something together. 3 calls from publicists already, she said. Aubrey said, 2 record labels by morning. He looked at his hands. The hall had gone quiet now, that particular post-concert quiet that felt like the absence of something enormous. The Claridge called, Constance said, the general manager. He wanted to. He wasn't quite sure what he wanted to say, actually. He said something about arrangements. Compensation, she paused. I told him you'd be in touch. Aubrey was quiet. Are you all right? She asked. I'm thinking, he said. About what? He thought about the East ballroom, the burgundy carpet, the chandelier's particular geometry at 2 a.m., the way the Bösendorfer looked in the maintenance lighting. Smaller than it looked under the gala chandeliers, more itself somehow. He thought about the 11 months of overnight shifts, the service corridor, the freight elevator. He thought about Renfield Greer's hand on the piano lid. He thought about the specific and familiar weight of being in a room and being asked, without words, to take up less space. He thought about sitting down anyway. The rent, he said. I was 2 months behind. Constance looked at him. When you found me, he said. I was 2 months behind on rent. I took the overnight shift at the Claridge because it was what was available, and because I needed the money, and because I had been very quiet for a long time, and I didn't know yet how to be loud again. And now? Constance said. Aubrey Mack looked at his hands. The hands that had cleaned floors and carried mop carts and pressed elevator buttons, and then, in the space between one breath and the next, had played in Roy Thomson Hall to 3,000 people who had given them a standing ovation. Now, he said, I remember. The Globe and Mail ran a feature the following Saturday. The headline read, He played for the Governor General. Then he cleaned the floors. Then he played again. The piece was shared 40,000 times by Monday morning. A clip from the concert, not the full thing, just the first 4 minutes of the Cape Breton composition taken on someone's phone from the 7th row, appeared on social media and was viewed 2.3 million times in the first week. In the comments, people wrote about the things that had been taken from them and the things they had kept. They wrote about rooms where they had been asked to stand near the wall. They wrote about the specific patient persistence of a talent that survives everything you put it through and is still there, waiting, when you finally sit down again. Someone wrote, that sound is what dignity sounds like when it stops apologizing. It was liked 44,000 times. Aubrey Mack did not see the comment for several days because he was busy. There were phone calls to return, contracts to read, decisions to make about a life that had just quietly and irrevocably turned back toward itself. But when he finally read it, sitting in his apartment with his morning coffee, the radiator ticking in the corner the way it always had, he read it twice. Then he set down his phone, and he looked out the window at the April light coming in over the city, and he was still for a long time. In the way that a man is still when something has finally been said that he has been waiting, without knowing it, to hear.